Good morning. I suppose there are very few organisations in Ireland that provoke as much of a sense of outrage as does An Taisce. This is particularly so in rural Ireland, where An Taisce is seen as having a very strongly anti-rural bias and doing everything it can to prohibit the provision of housing to rural communities in the middle of a housing crisis. I have considerable experience of dealing with An Taisce at various different levels, and I have to say that, like many organisations in Ireland, their position has, in my opinion, become unduly influenced by politics. It is important to look at why An Taisce was originally set up. It was set up around the time of the introduction of the original planning codes in Ireland, as it was seen as important that there should be a body which would advocate on behalf of the protection of Ireland's heritage, both built and natural. It was set up as a voluntary organisation, but with state support and recognition. This seemed like a good idea at the time and possibly was, but the reality is now that our environmental and planning legislation has become immensely complex. A former EU commissioner once stated that, having worked as a lawyer in the United States, he had always believed that the most complex body of legislation in the world was the New York Tax Code. That was until he came across the Irish Planning Code, which he found to be infinitely more complex. Our environmental legislation, which was initially introduced to deal with such matters as pollution control, has now morphed into a highly politicized regime. Those who seek to destroy free enterprise and the rights of property continually cite the externalities of environmentalism as a justification for doing so. Those who talk, for example, about climate justice, such as our esteemed former President, Mary Robinson, seem to be using this as an excuse to attack small businesses and to bring to an end an economic system based on private property and the rule of law as we have always understood it. On Taisce, like many voluntary bodies which have state recognition, have clearly been infiltrated by a highly politicized set of objectives and aims. Their main area of action now seems to be firstly preventing rural people from having access to rural housing, and secondly objecting to legitimate development, particularly for some reason of the agri-industrial type. Organisations like An Taisce have been given a major boost by the so-called Aarhus Convention from the European Union, which allows that environmental groups can engage in what amounts to speculative and even recreational litigation without having costs awarded against them. This is one of the many European directives that we have to be grateful for, which have resulted, uh, as per law of unintended consequences, in significant difficulties for Irish administration because of the manner in which we implement those directives. From my very detailed involvement with the Irish planning system at the most senior level, I would say that Ireland has an unfortunate habit of implementing European directives in the most strategically disadvantageous way possible. It is part of our best boy in the class syndrome, which possibly comes from our colonial past. In any event, the environmental process now has something quite unique in law, in that any third party litigant is entitled to put enormous expense on the first party without running any risk of incurring costs. Given the Irish penchant for often spurious litigation, this is a clear recipe for disaster, and so it is transpiring. We now find that legitimate developments are being held up frequently by An Taisce, a body which receives regular state subvention, even when they are objecting against proposals which the state itself backs. We would be very foolish indeed if we thought that environmental concerns can be considered as neutral, apolitical, or technical matters. They are highly political matters, and it is very questionable to me that any state funded organisation can choose to take a political side on those matters, which is different from that of the elected political authorities. For example, where people are to live is an entirely political decision. When an industrial or agricultural proposal is entirely in keeping with government policy, it seems inconceivable that a state supported organisation can use the minutiae of law in an attempt to have that proposal overturned. The reality is now that the politics surrounding organisations such as Antarctica have tended to become highly toxic. Environmentalism has become an acceptable password for the imposition of a communistic system of control over society, which bypasses the rights of private property, and which goes even further and bypasses the legitimate aims of democratically elected governments. Apart altogether from the destructive and delaying impacts which Antasca has on legitimate large-scale developments, it has made it its business, at a time of a serious housing crisis, to intervene in housing proposals, not just in rural areas where people have legitimate desire to live close to their original areas and to their families, but also even in urban areas where there is now a push for the creation of ever higher densities, which often result in the deracination of urban communities. I've already alluded to the very complex nature of Irish environmental and planning legislation. The reality is that An Taisce seems to have developed a particular skill set in the identification of what can often be trivial breaches of legislation, which are then used to bring legitimate developments to the highest courts in the land in order to get their way in what I would claim is essentially a political matter. Often this results in the depopulation of rural communities and in delays to legitimate economic development. There's no point any longer pretending that An Taisce provide a useful function for our society. It may well be possible for environmental groups to behave as An Taisce do, but they do not enjoy state subvention. They're not noticed bodies within the planning legislation. It is time, and long overdue time, that An Taisce is stripped of the privileged status which it enjoys and cut loose to engage in whatever political advocacy that it wishes to do. There can be no doubt that every piece of legislation which we introduce will have unintended consequences, and for those reasons legislation must be regularly examined to prevent ongoing abuses. We've recently seen a situation where there are up to 32,000 NGOs. As I said that right, 32,000 NGOs in a country like Ireland, and they cost this country some 5.9 billion euros every year. This is a classic example of legislation being introduced and then be let off without ongoing supervision from elected representatives. This must come to an end. This causes a huge taxation burden on ordinary people, often with very limited beneficial results. In regard to the environmental side of the NGOs, we must recognise that in concert with the Green Party, many people who set out with legitimate aspirations for protection of the environment have now morphed into organisations which have a hard leftist, not to say Marxist ideology, which is highly destructive for the future of this country. It is bad enough that organisations which delay legitimate development exist in a private capacity. It is entirely intolerable that they should also have state sanction, state support, and enjoy a privileged status. For those reasons, we in the Irish Freedom Party advocate that An Taisce be stripped of this status forthwith. The Irish Freedom Party believes in the comprehensive development of rural areas. We have many policies in regard to the regeneration of smaller towns and villages, and we believe in supporting local rural communities and local agriculture. Maybe you should check out our webpage and look at some of our policies. Thank you for listening. This has been Michael Leahy, Chairman of the Irish Freedom Party.